Welcome everybody to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. We are still on a bit of a vacation between seasons, but that doesn't mean that I haven't had time to interview some very interesting people. Hopefully you did hear my conversation with Kate Chisholm, the executive director of the Peter Foley Music Project from a couple of weeks ago. This conversation you're about to hear is my conversation with Andy Einhorn, the musical supervisor, musical director, and also the additional orchestrator for the latest version of Gypsy that just closed on Broadway. He also has a very deep relationship with Audra McDonald, and we do get into that with this conversation. So without further ado, Andy Einhorn, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start fairly broad here, and that is, how did you fall into loving musical theater?
Ooh, wow. That is actually a great question. I have two very seminal moments, actually. And they both involve being about 6 or 7 years old. The first was that I fell in love with watching my elementary school piano teacher play piano. And I was truly amazed that her hands were operating the keys and her feet were operating the pedals. And I was so stunned by that coordination that I came home and told my parents that I wanted to take piano. I don't know why it was that, but that was that. And then the other was I have a total, clear, incredibly visceral memory and sense memory, actually, to the very first time I was performing on stage. I had enrolled in a class at the local Jewish Community Center in Houston, Texas, and it was a theater class, and my division performed 2 songs. The first with a group was The Bare Necessities from the Jungle Book, and then I was chosen for a solo for the song I Got No Strings from
Pinocchio,
the movie Pinocchio. And again, I have such a clear memory of standing on a box singing that solo and the smell of that particular theater and the color of the shade of gel that was on the lights and what those kind of lights were. For some reason, it is deeply ingrained in my mind. And those 2 particular memories are really how I fell in love with performing. And for me, it was this absolute love of watching what happened when people came on stage and the electricity that was felt when one was in the audience. Mm-hmm. And people often ask me why I became a conductor. And to me, when I used to go watch shows in Houston as a kid, or when I was in shows as a kid, because I grew up professionally performing in Houston, I would always watch the conductor. And I found this incredible immediacy that of a realization that the conductor was the conduit between what was happening on stage and the orchestra and the audience. And this communing of sensibilities all coming together was ultimately why I fell in love with conducting, because that was really the nucleus or the synthesis of where everything then comes from.
That's cool. I mean, 2 things. One, I'm still amazed at people who are brilliant at playing the piano. Like, just the fact that you have 4 limbs doing sometimes drastically different things. I can barely walk and chew gum, so maybe that's just why I like that so much. But 2, I think in part you were talking about sense memories and still remembering the feel and being there in that auditorium. There is something about me that loves going to old community centers or theaters and stuff like that, where there's just that smell of probably old cigarette smoke, but also this the sweat and just the history, this kind of
exactly.
wafts
and
in.
And the old costumes back there, and the water damage around. Yes, exactly.
So were you a cast album collector at all growing up, or was it more you were going to see performances, but not necessarily collecting the cast albums?
I think a little bit of both, actually. But I distinctly recall starting to create a collection of playbills. Mm-hmm. Until at a certain point, my parents were like, you have too many of them. So then I had to start getting rid of them. But sometimes they're really funny because I still have ones that years later now when I work with people, I think, oh my gosh, I had those playbills. Right. Those people doing shows when I was younger. But cast albums for sure. I mean, I had a great mentor growing up who is a dear friend of mine, and he really educated me on cast albums and on musicals. And
who is that?
His name's Larry Dockslager, and he I grew up in Houston. He was one of my primary theater teachers, but then has also become a very close friend. And now he lives in Las Vegas. And he's actually, this is like a really very funny story. He's oftentimes my whisperer for when Audra and I are looking for new material.
Oh.
I will always him and say, oh, now we're starting to look for new material. And he'll always come up with these fantastic suggestions of songs for her. And at times he's written additional lyrics of songs. Like years ago, we did the song Let's Not Talk About Love, Cole Porter, and we had done a whole ukuleles, and he wrote an extra verse about Audra that we did in that. And so, but he's just been a font of knowledge for me and just really educating me on, you know, some of the greatest singers ever to live. In fact, I actually texted him recently because obviously the great Cleo Lane passed.
Right.
And I remember he introduced me to Cleo Lane, and not only her albums, but also her being in Drood and just like falling in love with her voice. So I always thank Larry because he really gave me that love of cast albums and just really devouring sort of that capture, because there's nothing quite like an exquisite cast album. And really, you know, when you're growing up in another location and you don't have access to the original production or even a studio cast album, or you don't have access to that production, you want to know what that was. And I think Larry was really one of the first people who taught me about what a cast album is in terms of how you capture performance and what you're really going for, and that it's not necessarily about every pitch being perfect or, you know, everything being perfect, but you're creating sort of I always say, like, you're doing two things at once. You're creating an oral performance that's meant to give what the visual and what the experience was to be sitting in the theater.
You know, the history of this podcast is also the history of me coming to terms with the cast album, because just like you, I grew up far away from New York City. Like, none of these shows would I have the chance to actually go and see a production of. So you might see a clip of a song on the Tony Awards, but by and large, I'm consuming these from the cast album. So I just think that they're a great historical document of like, okay, this is at least, you can hear the orchestrations, you can hear the performances, perhaps sped up so that they can all fit onto an LP.
Well, actually, it's funny to say that, because I think one of the craziest things is sort of realizing, like, when you would listen to an album and that was sort of what you became accustomed to was the show, and then years later doing some of these shows and realizing, oh no, there's more of a dance break here, or actually the song was really in a different key, and they created this transition, or they created a different key for the album because of all these reasons. And, you know, sort of like, I sometimes lament certain albums, like seminal cast albums, I won't name names of shows that I wish had often captured more because they're just so fantastic. But you're trying to imagine, sometimes a producer was creating an album for a very specific purpose, of whether it's to, you know, create hit songs out of it, or whether they were trying to really document what that production was.
Yeah, I feel like that must be like the hardest thing to crack, because that's kind of what I was leading up to, is that you have, like you said, seminal albums that like either cut out a certain song, or like the full version is not really included in the album, or maybe they do include a bit of a book scene, or they don't, or they want to add more context, or they leave it out. And so I think there's always this debate about like, how much do we bring in? What do we leave out? How do we stand apart from the rest? Especially for shows that have had multiple cast recordings. Is like, okay, how is this one going to be different than the other ones that have come before it, type of thing. And I guess I'm coming down on the side of it is like, I think like the best of the cast albums are ones that give you a good indication of what the show is, but also like what is happening around the music as well. I like a little bit of book scenes is kind of what I'm saying. Not full book scenes maybe, but a little bit.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I mean, at this point, I've had the great fortune of recording a number of cast albums. And, you know, when looking at Gypsy, obviously there's so many recordings of Gypsy. And I think the beautiful thing about it is that you have so many wonderful people who have played Mama Rose, and so it's been great to be able to capture those. You know, I think we live in a time today where I often say a cast album is, we're lucky to make cast albums so that things can be documented and we can remember that they happened. And I think when we were looking at our production, I saw this as an opportunity to feel free to make our own version of this, because I think I look at a lot of what the Gypsy albums have been along the way. It's been a pretty traditional look at sort of what the cuts always are pretty much the same. And one of the things that I really liked about what we've done with this production and how Audra is interpreting the role is that it really is a slow burn of a progression for her Mama Rose. And I think by having some of the dialogue and capturing what her sensibility was in the speech, I feel an audience really understands what her take on the material was. And I think there's a really nice through line and an arc that you can hear by having that additional material on here. I also love that we've put some transitional material in terms of some of these interstitial transitions, like leaving after Together Wherever We Go, going into the burlesque sequence. Sometimes like you just finished Together Wherever We Go, and the next thing you hear is the intro of We Gotta Have a Gimmick. But there's a large transition that happens there structurally in the show. And I think one of the things that George felt was really important was to usher an audience who isn't necessarily familiar with this into that. In some ways, our model of thinking for this album was really what's a radio play version of Gypsy. Yeah. I like that for this album. I think it gives it's a different take than other albums have done. We're doing a very different take of this production than other productions have done. And I personally think, in my humble and accurate opinion, that years from now, this album will stand up very well and be a great defense of what this production was. And I say that in all positive senses of the word.
I think so. I love the fact that there are so many of the transitions left into this album. Again, mostly because it's a little bit of a surprise. Like, oh, I don't know if I've ever heard this incidental music on an album before. I've definitely seen productions of Gypsy and seen recordings and stuff, or video recordings of it. So, but as an audio experience, it's like, oh, it's nice to have that little segue. Because I think if it is your first time really interacting with this show, there is a pretty big jump from that song into the strip and stuff. It's like, so wait, what is happening here? How did we get from point A to point B? So it's nice to have it usher along. And another thing that you just said that I really want to champion, because again, I have not seen this full production living all the way over here in Western Canada. I know that there was a little bit of like divisive talk off of Audra's like performance at the Tony Awards, but I think this album kind of shows how she gets to be there. There is that progression of like, oh, okay, it kind of locked in for me, like how this performance evolves over the course of the runtime. And so I appreciated having the chance to actually listen to the album in full, because it really makes that moment hit, I think, at the end of the album.
Oh, thank you. I mean, a lot of love and thought was really put into this album, and I have to give George C. Wolfe a lot of credit, as well as my co-producers on this, David Lai and David Caddick, both who also have extensive knowledge of cast albums, and good fortune of working with both David Lai and David Caddick on the cast album of Cinderella about 12 years ago. And we also created a similar approach on that album. And I loved, if you listen to the Cinderella album, again, you get almost the really storybook sense of what that is. And I just love the sense of thinking back to being 12, 13 years old, growing up in Houston and pouring over. I mean, there's like such a crazy story. So I said that I grew up performing as a child actor in Houston. And I had the fortune of a week before my bar mitzvah in Houston, I was up in New York working on a reading of a movie that actually never happened. But in the movie in the reading cast was Len Cariou.
No way.
Sweeney Todd. And so my actual cast album of Sweeney Todd is from Len Cariou. I still have the note that he wrote to me, wishing me a happy bar mitzvah. But I remember listening to that cast album, and what I loved about it was I got the whole show in there. And I remember the first time I heard Sweeney Todd and thought, oh my gosh, this is insane. What a genius thing. But I think part of our job now as documentarians essentially is to give people what that is. And obviously there are the bootlegs out there and people have, get happy for that kind of stuff. But like to have the chance to do this really is a great fortune. And also the thing that I'm incredibly proud of on this is that we had done, and one of the things that we talked about for this production was a restoration of the original orchestrations from 1959. And what I love is that I was able to work with the Julie Stein estate and Josh Clayton, who's a musicologist, music historian, and we crafted what those original orchestrations were, just culling that together, which was sort of I like to call it my mitzvah to the American musical theater. And then from that, we were able to do our version, adapt key changes and new dance arrangements for Camille Brown for her work, which I'm very proud of. And I just love that one of the things that David, and David said to me when we were recording this album, is we really want to capture the lushness of the orchestra. And I think if you find yourself listening with a really great pair of headphones or in a area where, a room with great speakers, I think you're going to hear a lot of detail in this orchestration that really makes it pop and come alive. And I think if anything, a lot of the way we balanced this orchestration was really with an ear towards what the strings do, because I actually think everybody knows Gypsy for the brass, and that's wonderful, but that's sort of already a component. But to me, there's something essential about the way the strings are written in this show. There's like a layer of overtones. It's going to get really geeky, but it's sort of this, it's like the fondant on the cake in a lot of ways. And it's the thing that cements this beautiful final layer of sound. And so like right away when you hear the overture, you really notice the strings in Everything's Coming Up Roses. And what I love about it is an incredibly lush line. And one of the things, after now having worked with Audra for almost 20 years, Audra's voice is so colorful and it has so many dimensions to it. And what I always love, obviously, is anytime I'm conducting for her, because in a large orchestra setting, that her voice just soars. Strings are drawn to her voice and sort of like honey. And so one of the things that you hear when you listen to this orchestration, and where we've put keys that I will again defend to my dying day very much suit her and her performance, I think when you hear that, you notice how well the two things are married together, but the richness of the strings really pops on this album. And I think that sort of darkness, I almost want to say, and I hear music sometimes in colors. So to me, there's like a rich blues and rich purples, and to me, like that's what highlights her performance, because she has that kind of oak-like, sound to her voice.
I mean, it's almost like silly to say this out loud because of how like decorated she is as a performer, but it's like she can actually sing. There's some great additions that she brings to this score. I think that's always
absolutely.
I mean, I know that it's sometimes said dismissively about it's been 5 or 6 years. I guess there's going to be a new production of Gypsy pretty soon. But I think what always excites me with this like well done material is like, okay, but that does give you an opportunity to do something a little bit different or go in an alternate direction or bring in new orchestrations. I think that the best of the canon can be kind of disassembled that way and be like, hey, we're going to do something a little bit different that hasn't been done before. We've seen how the other way has been done. Let's try something a little bit different.
100%. Why do we do revivals?
Right. I think that's the central question. Why do a revival?
I mean, truly, like, listen, I've spent a career doing revivals. Sometimes I call myself a dinosaur, but like at the end of the day, listen, they're really well written shows. So I'm thrilled that they continued to exist, and if anything, like it's a great tool for young writers to be watching and stuff, because like I think like it's fantastic material, obviously, but like I don't know, I think we have to be looking at these pieces again through the lens of where we're living today. I mean, one of the things that I'm really proud about this production is that we haven't changed the text. Like we're doing what Lawrence and Stephen Zahn and Julie Stein wrote. Like we're doing Gypsy, but we're hearing it through the lens of a different voice. And I think that's really important sometimes. Like I was actually a big proponent of the revival of Oklahoma in 2019. And I remember I saw it out at St. Anne's Warehouse before I saw it on Broadway. And I came home and I pulled out the libretto because I heard lines that I had never heard before, because the way speech was being used and cadence was being used. And I was so taken by that, because I thought, good on you. Like the point of doing a revival is to ask people who know the piece to listen with fresh ears. And for the people who don't know the piece, perhaps we're introducing them to a new world. I'm working on a tour of Sound of Music right now that Jack O'Brien has directed. And it began in 2015, and we're being given the chance to re-examine it again before it starts performances next month in Washington, D.C. at the Kennedy Center, I guess we still call it.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's like, is it going to still be called the Kennedy Center?
We still call it that, but okay. But I'm I'm really proud of that production because, again, we haven't changed it. And one of the things that I think Jack has really done beautifully in it is bring out the political undertones. That show was written against a very specific backdrop. And, I'm not going to go too deep here, but, we're living in interesting times right now. So it's really kind of fascinating to listen to that book against sort of what we're hearing right now.
Yeah, I get into this conversation a lot with people with the Rodgers and Hammerstein like oeuvre. I think if people have only encountered their shows through like their filmed versions, there can sometimes be this misconception of what those shows actually are, because they were very political. They were pretty dark. And sometimes you don't realize that until you see a stage version.
It is. But like, again, like what I love that Jack keeps saying is like, our job with revivals is to examine them, not change them, but to examine and understand why things were written in a very specific way. And, I learned a lot about Gypsy doing it. And I learned a lot about, when I did Carousel or when I did Hello Dolly, like these shows are beautiful to look at and to really understand. And I think anytime we did make adjustments or do our own version of the strip routine or do our own version of, the dance break of All I Need Is the Girl, like I think our job as creators is often to say, if we're going to change it, why are we going to change it? Are we laterally changing? Are we changing for the quote better? And what is the better? Like I always say, sort of, Camille A. Brown had a very hard task on this show. This show has always been in the vernacular of Jerome Robbins.
Yep.
Jerome Robbins and Arthur Lawrence have had their stamp on the show. And so, George's job was hard because Arthur has always been hovering over this show. But I think in some ways Camille had an even tougher assignment because the dance music composed by the brilliant John Kander was very specific and really, in a lot of ways, very instructive to what the steps were. And I remember there was a moment, when we got to that dance break where she felt very boxed in by the idea of Tulsa doing a waltz in that section. It's a very famous waltz and he talks through it and it's beautifully crafted around that. But she said, it's telling me exactly what I have to do. And so I felt like in that moment, I understood that she did not want to feel trapped in a way by that moment. And so if people want to look at the score, they'll see I've actually taken bits and homages of that waltz and put it in a different feel. And so it still intrinsically is part of that DNA. It's just been slightly shapeshifted for our production. And to me, like the musicology and the theory nerd in me looks at that and goes, well, I've left that for people to enjoy if they want to find the treasure along the way. But it's also, again, paying homage and saying that was wonderful for that time, but we're going to do our own thing and find our own vocabulary for this so that the choreographer can feel free.
Yeah, I enjoy the idea of taking those building blocks and just being able to put your own stamp on it to a certain extent without having to be like, creating a brand new work from scratch. I mean, I'm also one of the people who does believe that the Gypsy book, if not the best, is definitely within my top 5 of just like, it's kind of a rock solid text, so it's hard to like really quote unquote ruin it. So there's a bunch of questions that I want to get through here. So first, you brought up here a couple of times that you've known Audra for quite a while. When was it the first time you met her?
What's today? The 6th? Just yesterday. Yeah. Just kidding. No, actually, through a connection in Houston from Rice University where I went, who happened to have a contact at the opera there. She was brought down to Houston Grand Opera in early 2006 to do a double bill of Poulenc's Le Voix Humaine and a Michael John LaChiusa opera called Send, which was written as a modern day prequel to Le Voix Humaine. The opera wanted somebody to be on the music staff who had housing in New York and Houston, to which I did. And so I get a call from this former professor who said, there's this woman, you might have heard of her, but you should work with her. Her name's Audra McDonald, and she's coming down to do these pieces in Houston. And I wanted to throw your name to the music staff if you were interested in coaching her. And I was like, sure, that sounds great. And I think I was 20. I think I had just turned 24 at the time when I worked with her, 25. And I just remember walking in and, we hit it off right away because she said something to me that I was like, oh, we will definitely get along very well. And from there, we just stayed in touch. And then I started ending up playing concerts for her beginning around like late 2009, early 2010. And so we've been working together ever since. And then we'd actually never done a show together, actually. We sort of always kept that part of the marriage separate from one another. And then when this one came around, she was like, I need you to come do this with me. And I said, I understand. There's essentially a concert every night.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, weirdly, in my triptych of what I call the ladies, doing Hello Dolly with Bette Midler, and then Carousel with Renee Fleming, and now Gypsy with Audra McDonald, I feel like this might be the end of that triptych.
Yeah.
This felt like the real moment to finally do a show together. But yeah, I mean, we jokingly call each other our work wife and work husband, but it really, in some ways, like, one of the things that I've loved is that I think having that much history together made doing this production possible, because we're so lockstep in sync with one another that, if anything, we have such a shorthand of how we work together, that the night to night of it, I don't want to say it easy, because it's not easy, but I know it gives her great comfort in knowing that I'm there at the pit, and for me, I know the voice so well that I know how to shape the orchestra and keep the ship moving.
So what does that look like, I guess, for the rehearsal period? Is it Audra coming in with ideas, workshopping it, and then like working with George? Or is it George asking her to try something out? Or is it a combination of those things? Like, how does that actually work?
The first step actually in this production was that she and I met for about 6 weeks before we met with George, of just working on the material, like setting keys for her. And we really spent a lot of time, like, it was painstaking, because we would really keep shifting things around and playing around with sort of what her sound was going to be for this. Because again, in my humble and accurate defense of her, she is using her chest voice much more than Audra's ever used her chest voice in a role. And again, I'll take questions from people who want to ask that, but I will defend that. And then we started meeting with George, and we would almost do a little bit of a show and tell of things, and then listen to his comments and react accordingly. And so that process really then was about another 6 weeks of that. So it had lasted about 3 months before we had even gotten in the rehearsal room with the cast. But I really wanted her to have a good fundamental, or a good foundation of what the material was vocally, because there's such an incredible arc for the role. Musically, you sort of have these 3 tent poles of some people, everything's coming up roses, and roses turn at the end. And so, like, you're really trying to sort of, I like to look at roles as contour maps, and you're trying to understand, like, where the cadence is in all of that, and sort of your moments of repose, so that the voice can really relax. Because the second act is a fascinating study for the role, because she sings Together Wherever We Go at the top of the act, and then there's just a ton of speaking. And then it isn't until the end of the act, then you suddenly have to whip out the ball. But I mean, again, you know, now all the secrets are out, but starting in in summer of 23 and the end of 22, we had actually started doing Rose's Turn a little bit in concert, because I wanted her to start like understanding what that was. And when it came down to the Tonys, I remember there was a funny discussion of like, what's she gonna do? And, you know, when we approached her about Rose's Turn, weirdly, she was like, okay, that's fine. Because I think in a lot of ways, she has done that one out of context so many times. She was able to brilliantly drop in, which is kind of, you know, like such a funny thing of just saying like drop in. Yeah.
I mean, the other question I had, as far as like the orchestrations and the music for this version goes, in the liner notes here, at least, it's credited as being like, of course, you're a music director, but you have additional orchestrations and arrangements, and then also Daryl Waters gets a credit for additional orchestrations and arrangements. So was those separate songs you took? Did you work together? How did that collaboration work?
I adore Daryl. We ended up really working together a lot, because sort of a lot of the arranging duties started to fall to me in the rehearsal process, because Daryl was also building What a Wonderful World at the same time. So he was like building an entire musical start to finish. And so Camille and I would work on, say, like our strip sequence, like the Garden of Eden, and George always had this idea of a big Josephine Baker Duke Ellington thing. So I really came up with the drum chart for that. And then, you know, Daryl is a brilliant scholar of that early period of jazz. And so I said to him, this is what the assignment is. And then he came up with all that brilliant horn writing. And then, but for something like All I Need Is the Girl, that really is my sketch. But then I had ideas of sort of orchestration and would feed him thoughts of, I want the trombones here. And then I wanted to go to the woodwinds here. And then Daryl and I would work together on stuff like that.
Oh, that's cool.
It was a beautiful collaboration. I was like, Daryl's always been somebody on my top 5 list of people to work with. So I sort of felt like I was getting a bucket list experience on this.
When it comes to the actual album itself, you're in the booth for when the recordings are going on, or were you that hands-on involved with this production?
So for the actual album, I conducted the entire recording session. It was an incredible 2.5 days. I'll spare you the gory details of getting food poisoning immediately following.
No. Okay.
Literally got home and had a moment, but my body sort of gave out at that moment. But we did a Sunday morning, a Sunday night, and all day Monday. And those are long days. But the really nice thing of when we recorded, because it was later in the process than sort of normal, because normally with an album, you record it right after opening or somewhere around opening, or in the case of Hello Dolly, we actually recorded before we even started tech, which was just sort of crazy, but okay. And what was nice here was we ended up recording at a certain point in February, which gave us a lot of lead time for the performances to really grow and really deliver. And I think, especially for Audra, one of the things I've loved about our concert career is songs that we sang 10 years ago, she sings differently now. And I always describe the performances like a fine wine. It just gets better with age. So in a lot of ways, what's really interesting is to listen to the performance of Rose's Turn that's on there, and then compare it to the performance that was done on the Tonys. And then even if you saw what happened this afternoon, it continues to grow to this place. I'm always like, how do you still have that well? I always wish with people like Audra or even the Dolly album, I always wish you could then go back in one more time at the end of the run and be like, let's just record it at where it was now, so people really understand where something got to, because it's beautiful to watch that growth. But it actually, in a lot of ways, made the recording process easier, because there's such an ease at that point of recording the material. And what is tricky about a recording often is everybody's used to a very specific situation of where everybody's sitting in the pit, and then you bring it into a recording studio, and then suddenly the percussion is remote and the harp is remote, and then the drums are in their own booth, and then everybody's listening on headphones, and sometimes it really takes an extra few times of getting the thing moving. But what was so nice here is because the musicianship at that point was so tight and so in sync with one another, the recording of it was, I don't want to say easy, because it's never easy to do one of these, but it definitely flowed in a really nice way.
That's cool. I mean, I always wonder about that for the, singers and actors sometimes, because I'm sure you get so used to the actual blocking of the number that to be well, you have to stick to your microphone. You can't really move around all that much. I don't know. For me, it would throw me off slightly. They're consummate professionals, but it's a different environment than what it is on the actual stage.
Well, and what's hard about it is, for me, is, again, then you're listening to, you start hearing things differently, and you go, oh, I didn't realize this line popped out, or et cetera, et cetera.
So one thing I've always wanted to know, just to go through just a couple of the songs, the overture, one of the all-time great overtures of musical theater. What I always love listening on every new album of Gypsy is that there is this section that happens where the horns kind of just do whatever they want for 8 bars, it seems like. So is that written into the score where it just says go nuts, or just do what you want in these 8 bars?
Well, it's marked in the second trumpet as just an ad-lib solo. There's sort of there's lines that are suggested, but nobody ever plays what that is. And for, when you search for the player, you're really looking for a player that can substantially do that. And we were so lucky with our second trumpet player, and just let it rip in there. And I remember the first time I heard the solo there after she did it, on top of it, I was just so blown away by what she had created.
A song that, as people, maybe a long time listeners of this show, because we do go chronologically song by song through all of Sondheim's output. So Gypsy was a few years ago now that we went through. I was fairly dismissive of a song called Little Lamb. I have to tell you, I'm turning around on this song quite a bit. I think maybe in part because of this album in particular. Talking about, I think you mentioned here before about just not hearing certain things before, maybe musically, lyrically. It's, I don't know. This one just really hit me of like, oh, this is like a lost girl who wants to be, who's getting forgotten.
I think Joy's performance is really beautiful. Her voice records so well, and you really understand the intimacy of it, and she's not over singing the song. Like, it actually feels pleading. Like you hear the yearn of somebody who is lost, the yearn of somebody who's looking for themselves in this. And I think it's so, I actually love that about both Joy and Jordan, who obviously did a very different show last year. And then hearing them in this context, they're both so incredibly versatile. And I just love that it just captures the magneticism that both of them bring to their roles. But Little Lamb in particular just sounds so lush. Yeah. And I think we actually found like the perfect key for it. We're doing it in G major, which is not the original key. And what I like about it is like there's an openness to the strings because they're open strings for the violin. And so it just really blooms. And the whole thing has this, it just feels like it unfurls in a very exciting way.
So here's going to be the hardest question then. If you were forced to only be able to save one of these tracks, which one would it be and why?
Oh gosh. Oh wow!
I'm bringing out the wood chipper and somehow deleting all the rest of them.
Obviously, I'm very proud of Audra's Rose's turn on here. I think that again, I look so much at cast albums these days as really just gifts of preservation and less about any of us making a fortune recording cast albums. So I'm always, again, thankful that anybody says, will you go capture this? And I think back to Susan Stroman wrote to me after she saw the show, and she said, every student of musical theater needs to hear and watch Audra do Rose's turn. And at this point, now that we have it both recorded orally for our cast album and video for the Tony Awards, I feel like we've done our duty. Right. Because I think nobody will ever perform it that way ever again. And even as her friend and work husband, I rarely often say to her, you've done well, but like that is one of the moments where I am truly proud of that. That makes it sound like I never compliment her, but I'm not here to overly, stroke the ego, but I really feel like there's such a beautiful capture in this.
This is probably like a boring like production / I don't know, funding question. But now as more and more people, I would assume the majority of people are going to listen to this digitally rather than like buying an album specifically. Is there thought in the actual making of this of like, well, we can put in extra stuff or we can put in extra things because we don't have to worry about like an arbitrary time limit, or that doesn't really go into the thinking at all?
It's all sort of weirdly decided by 15-minute increments. That's sort of how the union stipulates.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
When you sort of like hit between 45 and 60, you get this bracket. Gotcha. And then if you go over, right. I think on this one, again, it really was like what felt necessary. Like we purposely chose not to record the entr'acte because if anything, like after Everything's Coming Up Roses, the entr'acte don't strike me down, but the entr'acte on the show is 3 utilities put together. It's Goldstone into Mama Was Married into You'll Never Get Away From Me. It's not like, you're not really hearing the music that differently. So for us, it sort of was like, okay, the overture is so brilliantly captured. Why are we going to do something that's really not that special at the end of the day? And it wasn't really going to change the overall shape of what the album was, Because again, you also have to think in some ways, like, people digest cast albums differently today than they did years ago. Not everybody is going to listen from start to finish. There are going to be people who only are going to zero in on X track. So when you think about real estate of what you're recording, are people really going to be like, oh, I can't wait for track 14, the entr'acte,
Then you get like the totally crazy people, in my opinion, who have told me that they listen to cast albums on shuffle. So they, which I mean, I guess that's an option too.
Okay.
You know,
Sure.
I'm catching you obviously between a matinee performance and an evening performance, but I would like to just ask you very briefly about what's coming up. I think I read that you're doing something called Joy, a new true musical. Am I getting that title?
Yeah, so actually that just opened off Broadway starring Betsy Wolfe. And we actually have a great concept album of that that I recorded with the composer Anne-Marie Milazzo, who the album's called The Shape of Things, Songs from Joy. And Anne-Marie is widely known as a brilliant vocal designer and vocal arranger for Next to Normal, Spring Awakening. She was the brain behind the orchestrations and arrangements of that Once on This Island revival in 2018. So she's written the music and lyrics for it. I really love this show. I've been with it for about 6 years since it's been in development. So we just did an off-Broadway run that'll end in a few weeks, and then we're looking for next steps. And I have the Sound of Music tour, which is about to open and run for a few years. And then I actually am in pre-production for a new Broadway show, but I can't tell you what that is, but I'm very excited about it because it's a show that I really love. It is a revival.
I was going to ask, is it a revival? Okay.
Yeah, it is, but a very different revival. And I'm very excited about the team who's working on it. And I have a few other new musicals that I'm working on. I'm really trying to start to focus a little bit more on new musicals because I think, like, obviously have loved working on revivals, but in a weird way, when I start to make a list of projects that, you know, shows that I would want to conduct or music direct at this point, I'm sort of like, well, they were all done in the last few years, so it's going to be a little bit before they come around again. You know, and Audra and I are obviously, we're already starting to book concerts into next year, and we're both like, oh, here we go again. You know, we're always on the road together. And I actually have like an incredible relationship with a few orchestras around the country, the Cleveland Orchestra, Philadelphia Orchestra, Pittsburgh Symphony, where I've started doing a lot more musicals in concert. And like next summer, we have a really exciting title that, again, sadly, I can't divulge. But it's in tandem with the country's, it's a very Americana show that we're create a symphonic orchestration for and do in a few orchestras starting next summer. So I'm very excited because, like, I love having the chance to perform the really golden age shows with the orchestra size that, like, you kind of ever dream of. I just did My Fair Lady in Aspen with Julie Benko and Raul Esparza. We had a 65-piece orchestra. And I mean, it was kind of insane hearing it, you know?
I had this really cool opportunity. I'm in this city called Calgary in Canada.
Oh, yeah.
And this was 2 summers ago where they did the symphonic, just a concert version of Ragtime. They had, like that 60-piece orchestra. It was like blowing me back into my seat. It was like a crazy, great experience. I just want to say that's so cool to do some like new musicals, because I mean, after you run out of revivals, you have to find new shows that you can revive in, you know, a few years from now. But I mean, I just get so excited about some of the new stuff that comes out, because it's like, I know it's like a semi miracle to get anything produced at this point anymore, and it's like a 6 or 7 year process just to get it up onto the stage. So it's like a Herculean effort, and I'm excited about it every single time.
Honestly, and I don't say this to sound as crazy as it is, but it's like it can be a little dispiriting when you realistically think about how difficult it is to get these up, because there's so much at stake financially. These things cost so much money, and you know, it's a commerce-based industry. You know, it's show business, and so there is money that you know, sort of makes all this happen. And so again, anytime we get to do one of these, I'm reminded of the extreme gratitude and blessing to be able to say, okay, yes, I've done these incredible productions, and I'm very fond of them and very happy that they all happened.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Andy, for taking some time out of your day and explain like a bit of your history and how this whole thing got made in the first place. The digital album of Gypsy with Audra McDonald is on sale now. Like, people can go and download it when this episode gets released at the very least. Any last things you want to communicate to the audience?
Please go listen to it. We're very proud of it, and I really do think it's gonna stand the test of time as a seminal recording of the show.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, someone tell me, when is it my turn? Don't I get a dream for myself? I'm the boys. I'm a taking